Lennox Lewis made the first defense of his reclaimed WBC title on October 4, 1997, in Atlantic City, against a mandatory challenger most of the division genuinely feared. Andrew Golota had earned that fear the hard way, not by beating elite opposition cleanly, but by physically dominating former undisputed champion Riddick Bowe twice in the previous 15 months.
At the end of the same round, Ruiz threw a crushing right blow.
Ahead on the scorecards in both fights, before being disqualified each time for repeated low blows. Golota's talent had never been the question. Whether he could keep that talent inside the rules for a full fight remained completely unresolved, and either version of him, the fighter who outboxed Bowe or the one who threw the fight away doing it, represented a genuine threat to Lewis. The first of those Bowe fights had ended not just in a disqualification, but in a riot at Madison Square Garden, chaos that followed Golota into every subsequent fight as a question mark about his temperament under pressure. That history made him harder to prepare for than a simple scouting report on his jab and power would suggest. A trainer game planning against Golota had to account for a fighter capable of boxing at an elite level for 6 clean rounds, and also capable of unraveling entirely if the fight turned difficult, and there was no reliable way to predict in advance which version would show up in Atlantic City.
Down under pressure, the champion's right-hand blow hit his target. John continued his attack, becoming blow and was knocked down.
Golota himself arrived in Atlantic City with a physical profile that made him unusually dangerous even among heavyweight contenders. Genuine size combined with hand speed that a fighter his frame did not typically carry. The kind of combination that allowed him to compete with Bowe on Bowe's own terms, rather than needing to out-tactic him from a distance. Scouting reports on Golota did not describe a limited puncher who could be walked through with patience.
Lennox Lewis, best punch is a hard, straight right hand.
The first round clearly showed that the audience was waiting for.
They described a live, technically capable heavyweight who had already beaten a former undisputed champion twice on the scorecards, and whose only reliable weakness was a discipline problem that had nothing to do with what he could do between the bells when he stayed within the rules. The atmosphere inside the arena reflected that uncertainty. This was not a crowd gathered to watch a routine title defense against an overmatched mandatory challenger.
His once-in-a-lifetime performance. Some say that Golota got confused and tried to fight the text spelling out Bowe on Bowe instead of Bowe himself. But true fans know that's nonsense. Golota.
It was a crowd that understood it might be watching the start of a genuine changing of the guard, given how thoroughly Golota had dismantled Bowe's own reputation over their 2 fights, disqualifications notwithstanding. Lewis had to walk to the ring, knowing the challenger across from him had already proven, against a fighter with a far more decorated resume than his own recent form suggested, that he belonged at this level. This was also a title Lewis had only just gotten back. He had regained the vacant WBC belt earlier that year against Oliver McCall, in a rematch remembered less for anything Lewis did in the ring than for what happened to his opponent. And defending it now against a live, dangerous mandatory challenger was the first real chance to prove that reclaimed title meant something beyond the strange circumstances of how he had won it back. Working again with trainer Emmanuel Stewart, Lewis needed a defense that looked nothing like his last outing. Decisive, competitive, and settled entirely by what he did with his own hands. He got exactly that, and got it fast. Lewis dropped Golota with a clean right hand early in the first round, the kind of punch that does not require a long build-up to land once a fighter has closed the correct distance and thrown with full commitment behind it. Golota rose from the knockdown, still in the fight in the technical sense of being upright and able to continue. But Lewis did not give him any room to reset his composure or his feet.
I think he had been thrown to the canvas.
Now there is no 3 knockdown rule in effect. There is blood.
John came to his senses and became more cautious. A minute before
He closed immediately, backed Golota against the ropes, and finished the sequence with a follow-up combination that ended the contest at 95 seconds into round 1. Referee and ringside physician had no real decision to make once that final flurry landed clean. The stoppage was as unambiguous as the knockdown that preceded it. What made the finishing sequence technically significant was the absence of hesitation between the knockdown and the follow-up. Many heavyweights, sensing an opponent is hurt, still pause fractionally to reassess distance and balance before committing to a finishing combination, a habit built from years of training to avoid overcommitting into a counter from a wounded but still dangerous opponent.
A brilliant sequence that was sure to let Bo know who was boss. Throughout the rounds, Golota had been dipping left up the perfect angle to target Bo's scrotum.
Lewis skipped that pause entirely. The moment Golota's feet were set again, but his composure was not, Lewis closed the ground and started throwing, treating the recovery window as an opportunity rather than a risk to be managed cautiously. The speed of that finish mattered as much as the fact of it. A one-round knockout against an ordinary opponent says something about power. A one-round knockout against a fighter who had just spent 15 months making former champions look overmatched, even while fouling his way out of the credit for it, says something closer to a statement about hierarchy. Golota's power and skill were never in doubt walking into this fight. What Lewis proved in 95 seconds was that neither of those things mattered if the challenger never got the chance to use them. There is also a counter-argument worth taking seriously, one that any honest account of this fight has to acknowledge. A 95-second knockout, however clean, does not by itself prove Lewis had solved every question Golota's style posed. It proves he solved the specific version of Golota that showed up for round 1, before fatigue, frustration, or accumulated pressure had the chance to change his composure the way they had against Bo. A longer fight might have tested Lewis differently. That is a fair point, and also, in a sport built around finishing opponents before they can find a rhythm, largely beside the point. Lewis was not obligated to let the fight develop into a referendum on Golota's endurance. His job was to win, as early and as decisively as the opening allowed, and against the most feared mandatory challenger in the division, he did exactly that. Lewis's own path to this moment had started well before his professional career, with an Olympic super heavyweight gold medal in 1988, and the fight against Golota showed exactly what that amateur foundation had built on top of. Not just power, but the timing to close a fight the instant an opponent's balance broke, without wasting the opportunity by giving him even a few seconds to recover it. A less disciplined finisher lets a hurt opponent survive to the bell out of caution or fatigue. Lewis did neither. The finish also settled, at least for one night, a question that had followed Lewis since the McCall rematch. Whether the fighter capable of controlled, patient boxing was still capable of the explosive, decisive violence heavyweight fans and networks actually wanted to see from a champion. A career built entirely on cautious, technically sound decisions eventually gets described as boring, regardless of how effective it is. And a champion labeled that way loses commercial value even while winning every fight. 95 seconds against one of the most feared punchers in the division answered that question about as completely as a single fight can. For the rest of the heavyweight division watching from outside the ring, the message was equally direct. Golota's 2 performances against Bo had suggested a genuine passing of the torch was underway, regardless of how those fights technically ended. Lewis's 95 seconds argued the opposite, that whatever hierarchy Golota's disqualified wins had implied, It did not survive first contact with a champion who was faster to the finish than Golota had been given the chance to be to anything. For Lewis, this defense did specific work that the McCall rematch, for all that it returned the title to him, had not been able to do. It gave the division a finish built entirely on his own finishing instinct, rather than on anything happening to his opponent independent of his punches. And it did so against the challenger most likely to have given him genuine trouble if the fight had gone longer. Golota's reputation as one of the most feared men in the division survived the loss, because the manner of it, caught early, finished fast, no chance to find his own rhythm, read less like a referendum on his talent and more like a demonstration of just how dangerous Lewis had become, at the exact moment he could least afford another strange or unsatisfying result. That is ultimately why this fight belongs in any serious account of Lewis's championship reign, even though it lasted barely longer than the walk to the ring itself. Title reigns are remembered less for their total number of defenses than for the handful of nights that answer real questions about a champion's character. And this one answered two at once. Whether Lewis could finish a dangerous opponent decisively when the moment called for it, and whether the strange circumstances of the McCall rematch had left any lingering doubt about his own authority as champion. 95 seconds against a man who had just terrorized a former undisputed champion for 15 months left no room for either question to remain open. Golota walked into Atlantic City as arguably the most feared name in the division. He walked out of it as proof of exactly how completely a truly dangerous finisher can end that fear before it ever has the chance to matter. And Lewis walked out with the clearest possible answer to every doubt his own title reign had accumulated up to that point. Not through 12 rounds of careful, defensible boxing, but through 95 seconds that no amount of scorecard debate, no controversial stoppage, and no strange circumstance surrounding his opponent could ever take away from him. In a division where nights like that one are rarer and more valuable than any title belt alone,